I'm a little bit comfortable just for as a footnote. Thank you all for coming, and thank you Boston Study Group for having me here. First of all, my apology to everyone present here, since I might not be in a position to give a scholarly analysis of the topic entitled Non-caste Societies, Epistemology and Challenges in India. Nevertheless, I shall throw some perspective on non-caste society who are known by the name tribes in India. At the outset, it is imperative to state my location, that is my epistemological location as a researcher, as it is from this location that I draw my perspectives and analyze my data. I belong to the Pumai Naga tribe, which is recognized as one of the scheduled tribes by the government of India, located in the state of Manipur, northeast India. What I will do in this 25 to 30 minutes is that I will talk about 8.6% of the total population of the country, that is 104.3 million people. However, it's impossible to talk on each and every single tribe in the country, as their issues, culture, traditions, customs are unique in its own way. Therefore, it's not possible for me to give a pan analysis of tribal situation or tribal conditions in India. And that's one of the reasons I apologize before you. However small the tribal society or tribal population in the country, they are very diverse in nature. There are 705 ethnic groups in India who are identified as tribes according to the 2011 census. I'm going to make an argument on the line of body that Indian state is a caste state. It is not a neutral state but a caste state. One way to analyze this aspect is to look at Indian social reality from the binary of caste and non-caste society. There are two types of communities in India, that is caste and non-caste communities. What dominates right now is a caste community or non-caste community. The state is actually taken by the caste community. This has a bearing on tribes in India and partly explain why scheduled tribes are always at the bottom of any development indicators in India. We can have a quick glance at some of the basic facts and figures. This map show us the tribal population where tribals are in India. There are two states which doesn't have any tribal population, that is Punjab and Haryana, and the state which are red color, their tribal population is equal to or above or below 5%, and those states which green color, it shows the tribal population has more than 40% and above. And if we look about the populations of scheduled tribes from 1961 to 2011, it is clearly that tribes predominantly inhabit in rural area. For instance, 2011 census, 104 million people resides in rural areas. So there is only 11% of tribals resides in urban areas. So tribals predominantly a rural affair. And if this gives about the tribal populations in the state-wise, Madhya Pradesh has the highest tribal population with 14.7%, followed by Maharashtra, Odisha, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and so on. And more disturbing is the literacy rates of all social groups. Scheduled caste, like SC stand for scheduled caste and ST stand for scheduled tribes in India. So if we look at 2011 census, tribal literacy rate is 58.96, whereas all social categories 72.99. But if we look at 1961, it's just 8.3%. Of course, there's a dramatic increase in that. And if we look at scheduled tribe enrollment in higher education, it's merely 4.39% of total population in the country. Moreover, as per the National Family Health Survey 2005 and 6, the infant mortality rate was 62.1 per 1,000 live births among tribes, and under 5 mortality was as high as 95.7 per 1,000 live births. And another disturbing figure is the dropout rates of tribal students. If we look from classes 1 to 5, the dropout rate is 35.6. However, if you look from classes 1 to 10, it's 70%, above 70%. And it is estimated that from 1951 to 1990, mega development projects such as dam, mining, wildlife sanctuaries, and factories have displaced over 21 million people in India. Out of these 21 million people, 8.54 million have been enumerated as tribals. Thus, tribal constitute above 40% of the total displaced people in India, even though their population is less than 9%. Tribes in India are the most marginalized society. One need to problematize the Indian state approach to development. Since independence, the administrative division has been rearranged from time to time with a view to address the development as well as social identity issue. In spite of such rearrangement, the development status of India has been far from uniform. There are differences along the lines of region, state, caste, district, and even villages. India's development experience points to a scenario of extreme disparities and segregation. Here, I would like to quote the positions of the tribal intellectual collective India that care must be taken while theorizing development in the light of state's current development paradigm, which are framed in such a way that tribal or Adivasi displacement and distractions are seen as necessary for national economic growth. And most importantly, in the their need to produce knowledge that does not in any way, either consciously or by default, affirm further operation of Dalit societies across the length and breadth of Indian society. Tribes experiencing what is called the waves of colonialisms, or what Professor Khaka termed as double colonialisms. One in the hands of the British and the other in the hands of the non-tribal populations. However, for dominant societies, tribes are suffering from what is called subalternity and analyze the tribal social reality from the post-colonial framework. For tribes, we are not yet experienced post-colonial. For us, post-colonial is just an idea. Yes, tribe has gone through waves of colonialisms, and that is why we should look at the world, all our social reality, from the framework of the waves of colonialisms that explains our reality, and that is the positions of the tribal intellectual collective India. We acknowledge that there are bigger tribes which are colonizing the smaller tribes. Example, Nagas, Mizos, Santals, Mundas, Orons, and others. Most of the tribes which one don't hear about are being colonized by the bigger tribes in India. The challenge as academics is how to visibilize the unheard voices of the smallest societies or tribes, since we are not an articulation of the dominant tribe. Thus, ignoring the multifacets of marginality and periphery within the region and within the states amounts to the denial of tribal existence. The challenge on the part of the Indian state is to provide space for synchronizing tribals' lived experience, the traditional institutions, value systems along with the modern values of equality, justice, freedom, fraternity, mutual respect, emancipation, and non-discrimination while formulating development policy. For too long, the state has been catering to the dominant groups, which has tended to induce assimilation through the politics of ethnic power and hegemony over the ethnic minorities. Development policy conceptualized and based on the premise of population size and dominant culture has further escalated the tension and development disparity between the society living at the margin of history, economy, and crisis of identity with those of the majority. The observations of Bodhi on widening politico-historical gap between the Indian state and tribe is interesting to note. He writes, the manifest situation, unfortunately, is the widening politico-historical gap that already existed between the Indian state and the tribes or the Adivasi peoples. The end result of this is problematic, characterized by a brutal imposition of the state framework on tribal realities, being the disconnect, deprivation, and further entrenchment of tribal from Indian state, coupled with a range of subjective distortions of tribal lived reality. This is related in many ways to their subjective alienation and felt loss of common over what they conceive to be their mutually endowed resources and their culturally embedded life world. Unquote. The politics of dominance, the denial of rights, and historical injustice by the dominant caste community over the tribe in India has led to various forms of articulation by tribes. And one such articulation is by the tribal intellectual collective India in the form of perspective from within, which I'll come in a while. Before that, I will show you one small video clips about Indian state approach to development, and the video clip which I'm going to show you about is a national highway, the situation or condition of national highway. This highway connects between two tribal states. Well, that's the condition of the highway. That's National Highway number 102B, connecting the state of Manipur with that of Mizoram. And that video was taken in 2014. Till today, the highway conditions still remain the same. It's unmotorable. To continue, tribals are not only marginalized and displaced in the realms of development, but more pervasive is the case of their epistemology and theory produced from such locations that are subject to various forms of marginalizations and invisibilizations, experiencing exclusions and inferiorization. I shall take you through the discourse on tribes and how they are being framed from European and caste/nationalist perspective and locked from within those framework. Over the century, tribe has been terrorized and variously described as natives, indigenous peoples, scheduled tribes, and among others. They are called as Aborigine in Australia, minorities in China, Indian in Central America, hill peoples, forest dweller, Adivasis, ethnic minorities, etc. in India. The concept and category of tribe has been theorized from various perspectives or from different theoretical locations. For instance, the theories that dominated during the 19th century was evolutionism. The dominant theories include Morgan, Marx, and Durkheim. They conceptualize tribe in an evolutionary framework and based on the principle of successive. In India, with the establishment of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, there have been general works on communities in India that later came to be called tribes. The leading scholar during this period are Dalton, who wrote a book called Descriptive Ethnology of Bengal in 1872, Risley, who wrote on tribes and castes of Bengal in 1891, Thurston wrote a book on castes and tribes of southern India in 1909. The 19th century ethnographic view on tribes argued that the term referred to both a particular type of society based on kinship ties and a stage of evolution. At the dawn of the 20th century, tribes were juxtaposed with the rise of the Indian national and caste-centric theories existing together with British colonialism. This is well reflected on scholarship during this period of time. Scholars and administrators alike did not give a serious effort to delineate tribe from castes. Hence, tribes have been seen as a natural equivalent of castes. A contrast has been drawn between tribes and castes, and even change among tribes has primarily studied in terms of the transformation into castes. The tribe-caste continuum has been reinforced in the post-independent tribal studies by Hindu nationalists. One such scholar is none other than J.S. Gore, who categorized Adivasi or tribes as backward Hindus due to their incomplete absorption into mainstream Hindu civilization. Khakha termed this the denial of difference approach. However, there was an attempt to define tribes on the basis of one's religious practice. For instance, during the 1901 and 1911 census report, the category so-called enemies was added to the list of castes and others in the census. Thus, it is interesting to note that tribals were identified as those who practice animism and those who pass. Some of the broad characteristics or traits of feature that were used to classify or categorize tribes in India includes backwardness, living in inaccessible places, speaking tribal dialect, practicing animism, self-governance, outside state and civilizations. Tribes in India are thus defined not so much in terms of coherent and well-defined criteria, but in terms of the administrative classification that divides the population into tribal and non-tribal or caste or non-caste society. They are treated as those groups enumerated in the Indian Constitution in the list of scheduled tribe, according to Article 342 of the Constitutions of India. The debate among sociologists and social anthropologists in 1930s on the question of tribes in India subsequently shaped in the form of isolation versus assimilation and integrations in 1960s, or what is called as cultural paradigm to security paradigms. The protagonist who advocated the policy of isolation for tribe was none other than Elvin. On the other hand, J.S. Gore advocated the policy of assimilation for tribes. He argued that tribes were Hindu, or to put it more bluntly, backward Hindus. He thought of tribes as inferior, backward, and identified them as standing a step lower on the evolutionary ladder and in fact not being very different from the mass of the Indian populations. He posited that tribes should be assimilated into the larger society so that they could be lifted out of their abject poverty and base living conditions. Bodhi and Jojo argue that the theoretical historical view of isolation, integration, and assimilation emanating from caste society that lay the ground rules of debate pertaining to tribal society is not as innocuous as it seems. Isolation, integration, and assimilation of tribe for caste is often perceived as freedom, negotiations, and adaptation by those framed as tribal societies respectively. These theories got manifested in policy in the form of protections of cultural distinctiveness as envisaged in the 5th and 6th schedule of the Constitution of India. By 1974, with the introductions of tribal subplans, the dimension of development was added to policy framework. However, the theoretical framework of civilizational evolutionism continues to dominate even during this period, with caste society seen as civilized core and tribes as the uncivilized periphery. For instance, Andre Bette articulated that tribe exists outside the ambit of civilizations and the state. This gives the perspective of coexistent approach where tribe is considered to be a product of history. The remnant of this theory still persists in the form of subalternity and evolutionism. Body 2017 argued that the current dominant theoretical framework has bounded tribes under rigid wave of colonial frames. Over the year, much conceptual brutality have been committed by the likes of A.C. Roy, G.S. Gore, N.K. Bose, Andre Bette, and a string of other upper caste social anthropologists who try to lock Adivasi or tribes within a subterranean Brahminical framework that infantilize non-caste societies. The universality of colonial Western European knowledge became a powerful colonial tool that its application produces some of the most horrendous events in its history to this very day on the category of tribes in India. This framework is being perpetuated by the dominant caste epistemologies, and tribes are entangled within this pervasive caste society. For many indigenous people across the world, and with a special reference to tribes of Adivasi in India, it began with the characterization of such society, what Gruss Frogel termed as people without writing in the 16th century, to people without history in the 18th century, and the 19th century followed by people without development, and most recently, right to the early 21st century, as people without democracy. It is interesting to know the critics of the colonial and caste framework on tribes and new theories framed around the perspective and discourses. That's what the tribal intellectual collective call as perspective from within, which gives an alternative framework to comprehend tribal social reality from the framework of waves of colonialisms. The major departure from dominant theoretical discourse is offered by Virginus Kaka, who fan of colonial and Brahminical epistemological works on the conception of tribes in India. He reposed the dominant methodological rumination on conceptualizing of tribes and reiterate that the terms of reference for the study of tribes in India should not be caste, peasants, or social heterogeneity, but rather as a groups or communities such as regional communities, for example, Bengali, Assamese, and Gujaratis. For him, tribes is not just mere cultural communities whereby tribes just sing and dance and became a data or empirical data for others. Rather, a tribe is a whole society like any other society, with their own language, territory, culture, customs, and so on. Hence, as society, tribe must be compared with other societies and not with caste, as has been the case in sociological and anthropological writing. Echoing from this perspective, Bodhi and Eka posited that by tribes we mean not only a socio-cultural entity as conceived by most anthropologists, but also a politico-historical entity. It is neither a caste nor a peasant group, and neither it is a stratified grouping, which in due course of time will lose its sense of itself as nationhood in the sea of caste, reality, and hierarchy. Coming to the aspect of organic tribal theory, I would like to put in place the perspective from within, which we at Tribal Intellectual Collective are working for the past few years. By perspective from within, we also have a way of seeing this world. We also have a way of saying something about what is happening. There is no single discourse dominating how we should see the world. Each of us has our context, our history, our language, our culture, our relationship to land, water, forests, and other resources. And we also have a way of looking at the world. We are not saying that only tribe can speak about tribes. Everyone can speak, but that is the perspective. It is not the truth, but perspective. The challenge is that till today, the dominant castes are the truth, and we are only data or empirical evidence for others. And what we say is just like you are expressing your emotion, or whenever we say we're being tagged as, that's a political statement. These paradigms dominate Indian academics, universities, literature, and everywhere. The positions of tribal intellectual collective, for instance, about Arundhati Roy, introduction to Dr. Ambedkar's book on Annihilation of Caste, where she wrote the introduction entitled The Doctor and the Saint, whose intention we see it a sophisticated manipulation of historical events to manufacture a fault line between Dalits and tribes in India. However, we are working to challenge these interpretations of history by studying Dr. Ambedkar's relationship and engagement with all communities, that is more than 700 communities who are identified as tribes in India. However, one has to wait as the project is a massive exercise. It is also interesting to note how upper caste agenda is to pitch tribes in domain like anthropology against Dalits. We at Tribal Intellectual Collective want to challenge that. For us, an organic tribal theory that affirms is wrong, or for that matter, any marginalized group. The challenge before us is that till today, we are looking at the world in the image or the mirror created by someone else. I'm experiencing the world through your looking glass. We say this is problematic and it does not unravel our social reality. We want to see the world we have, if we want to see the world, we have to have our own looking glass and create the space from the organic historical context. Thus, epistemology is the key for tribal emancipation. How do we problematize this? Here, I once again would like to state the positions of Tribal Intellectual Collective on few key epistemological considerations which are fundamental to tribal or Adivasi theorizing. 1. The need to posit epistemological premises that challenges gender and class stratification within tribe or Adivasi societies in the light of increasing complexities, fragmentation, and social inequality arising within each tribe or Adivasi society across the country. 2. The dire need to produce knowledge that does not in any way, either consciously or by default, affirms the further operation of Dalit societies across the length and breadth of Indian society. The imperative of producing knowledge that invisibilize, silence, or immobilize small tribes or Adivasi societies, and the care that must be taken while theorizing development in the light of state current development paradigms, which are framed in such a way that tribe or Adivasi displacement and destruction are seen as necessary for national economic growth. This stemming from a dominant misconception that tribes or Adivasi are mere object for necessary alteration, rather than as thinking reflecting subjects with historical rights over the land, culture, and territory. These perspectives give space for a respectful engagement across fluid community boundaries, yet propel researchers to search, locate, and position themselves around the ability to occupy a point of view firmly grounded from within rather than without. Today, we are experiencing of what Nathan and Kaka term as social exclusions and adverse inclusions. To conclude, I would like to quote Virginus Kaka, and he says that tribes are not merely at the margins, but possible even outside the margin of the Indian national identity. Unquote. Thus, epistemology is fundamental to knowledge production and tribal emancipation. Thank you all.
Thank you, dear brother Raile. A very enchanting presentation. You have really given a tour de force. You've introduced us to the tribal statistics of tribal life, and then you have plunged into a very critical and rather not discussed question of the epistemological presentation of tribal communities. And as you say, the epistemology is the key for tribal emancipation, if I paraphrase, if I've got it correct. And I think this is a very important observation. I thank you also for bringing the historical anecdotal studies, Raile, and then also going through the evolutionary dynamics of Marx and Durkheim that we often read when it comes to understanding the tribal communities. You also gave us this perspective of non-caste societies. I love this concept actually. The caste is the casteist society within you operate, and within this Brahminical hegemony, which is evidence of hierarchies. But then the non-caste societies is still not different. I mean, it is still being hammered through dualisms. One is the colonial kind of, as I was saying, the kind of Euro-American kind of imperial gaze, and the second is the Brahminical gaze upon this, and this is a very terrible situation. I was giving this diversity tour in India for about a month, and I had presented representation of Indian social groups in various sectors, starting from government, in the positions of like the cabinet ministers, then we had a bureaucracy, a judiciary, faculty positions, vice chancellors, film and television, and I had given and of all the data that I had, the worst affected group was scheduled tribes. They were the lowest in every ranking you can go to if it's talk about.
We just think about and be conscious of in our own engagements with difference. The second question that I had was, you said, if I heard you right, you said something about anthropologists' work that kind of pits Dalits and tribals against one another almost. So I was curious to hear a little bit more about that. So those two questions.
Should I? Yeah. Well, I think I'll start with your second question. Why I say this, in the domain of anthropology, it's essentially dominated by the upper caste communities in India. And if we look any of the books or anything written about tribes, they always try to pitch that. And for instance, I think the best example is G.S. Gore, how he termed tribes or like Adivasi as backward Hindus. And that in the way, and one of the essential problems, or the things, the challenge which is facing right now is that, as it's also pointed out, the change in the tribal society is also seen or studied through the transformation into caste society. And also there are the writings of the Andrei, like the writings of the, for instance, the latest is Arundhati Roy, how she tried to use Ambedkar and try to pitch against Dalits and tribes, trying to create a divisions in the binary between that. Yes, you are different, but what I believe, I can speculate on that, is we are going through a similar process of marginalization by the process which historically, been like the caste systems. And recently I was going through the statistics of who are those who practice caste systems in India. This is 2012 statistics, came out by this India Human Development Survey. So among this religious group, for instance, the Hindu, they practice 30% of Hindus practice untouchability. Muslim, they said 18% of Muslims practice untouchability. 5% Christians, they practice untouchability. 23% of Sikh practice untouchability. But when it comes to Buddhists, it's only 1%. Jain, 35% of Jains practice untouchability, and tribals 5%. And if we look at about the social category, for instance, Brahmin, 52% of Brahmin practice untouchability, and the forward caste 24, OBC 33%, SC 15%, 22%, others they put 13%. And on your first question, I think I can just speculate about it, because for very long it was the colonial, during excavations, during the expedition tour, they have projected tribes in such a way that they're considered as savage, uncivilized, and need to civilize them, and judging purely from the basis of their civilization, going to the tribal areas, writing about, for instance, the book like the Baga, or for that matter, Naked Nagas, that's Hemendrov books. So that's been projected across the world in such a way, and that's the domain of the anthropology of the study of tribes. So I could speculate on that.
Same with what John was saying, the lens is coming into this perspective. But how about having a comparisons of the tribal experiences with other, for example, experience. You mentioned about Australia briefly. You talked about America. Is there any effort from the tribal intellectual collective to reach out to solidarities across this? For example, the Dalits have started. What I'm saying is so there is this Dalit tribal collective that is working on this. So does this collective have any plan, intellectual, but also through intellectual creating a mass movement kind of? Yeah.
We at Tribal Intellectual Collective, we're trying our best as many like us to across the globe. For instance, we are learning a lot from the tribals from the Australia. For instance, like decolonizing methodology, also from America about epistemology of the South. So we are our decolonization process. That's how we're trying to look at how the tribes or across the indigenous people across the globe do it. And at the ground level, till today, like we haven't really reached across the globe. But what we are doing is that in India, we organize a seminar, but our seminars are not in this kind of rooms. So we normally have seminar in the village, whereby we go into the community, we learn from them, and we sit in the village, in a house, like in one particular house. So we have and families host us. So every year we try to have a seminar once in a year in the villages. So that's how, and also closely coordinating with activist groups working at the grassroots level, and also with Ambedkarites movement, we're also coordinating together. For instance, our national convener he's working on Ambedkar and tribes in India. So there's also a group on Ambedkar and tribal Dalits and tribe collective in India, which we are closely associated and which we are closely working towards it. So we are still in the very, very new in that field, so we're trying our best. Don't know how far we could reach to it.
Dr. Ziipao, thank you so much for a very enlightening talk. Unfortunately, I was a little late. My name is Yasir Latif Hamdani. I was invited by Suraj here. I come from across the border from your country, from the other side, Pakistan. My interest obviously in this issue, obviously, this is the first sort of my real introduction to both Dalit and tribal issues, but I did read Annihilation of Caste by Arundhati Roy, and I was very interested in sort of understanding what it is that you're saying about what is it that, if you could, what it is particularly about her argument that you think pits Dalits and tribals against each other, because that would be a very interesting thing for me to sort of find out.
Well, I can just read out exactly what she said.
Okay, great. Great, thank you so much.
Yeah. It's in page 62.
Okay. Page 62.
Just 1 second. I did not capture the full. I was reacting to this statement. My proposals do not cover the Aboriginal tribes, although they are larger in number than the Sikh, Anglo-Indians, Indian Christians, and Parsis. The Aboriginal tribes have not as yet developed any political sense to make the best use of their political opportunities, and they may easily become mere instrument in the hands either of a majority or minority, and thereby disturb the balance without doing any good to themselves.
This is Ambedkar.
Yeah, this is Ambedkar, and she writes, "This unfortunate way of describing a community was sometimes times aim at non-Adivasis too, in an equally troubling manner. At one point in Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar resort to using the language of eugenics, a subject that was popular with European fascists. Like this is what she goes on the range of that what she describes about the tribes and about her texts and Ambedkar's and the writings about the tribes. But I do admit that there was some tensions between Dr. Ambedkar and some tribals during the constitutional debate. But one had to see the true visions of Dr. Ambedkar in the forms of the 6th and the 5th schedule, what he has done for the tribals. I think that is the biggest contribution. And not only that, it's Article 19 of the Constitutions of India.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, and just to sort of add, I don't want to take up, I mean, this is a very fair point with a historical figure, seminal figure. In my opinion, I, as a South Asian, I'm speaking as a Pakistani, but I'm speaking as a South Asian as well. I consider Dr. Ambedkar as this seminal figure of 20th century in subcontinent. Then I consider Jinnah, and then I consider Gandhi. So I'm very clear about the hierarchy. But in terms of Ambedkar's thought, a lot of this has been made with the right wing in India, the upper caste right wing in India. I've also seen them trying to pitch Ambedkar against Muslims, by quoting out of context things from, his classic Pakistan or Partition of India. So this is a very interesting appropriation by certain groups. I was surprised that, Arundhati Roy has done that, though I think she's kind of, she is condemning, she's criticizing Ambedkar, but, fair enough.
I mean, there is a book written, Ambedkar on Muslims. There's a whole entire book, and how Ambedkar approaches the question of it kind of clears the air, because the kind of selecting quotations and then the whole program. For example, in roundtable conferences when the rights were bargained in London, it was the Aga Khan. It was so there is a book. It's available in Harvard Library. It's called Ambedkar on Muslims, and it gives us
absolutely
a whole kind of.
And his criticisms were very valid. I mean, this is taking away from the main conversation, but his criticism of, I speak as a Muslim here as well, his criticisms of Islam that he makes are valid criticisms that any Muslim modernist would also make. So, I mean, that's just, how it is.
So, my question was, some of my research work is around communal and ethnic violence. So my question was also about, as part of the project to Hinduize Dalits, that appropriation, using them as the weapon in communal violence. Similarly, if you look at in the Northeast, and I think in Orissa and Kanmal, tribal communities are also being sort of, with the borders are the most the archetypal example of animistic community, which is over time, you can say, they're becoming more Hinduized. Now there's almost like factions now, and that's associated with the ethnic violence that's there. Do you see similar trends in other parts of India, or what's your take on that? Because once the violence happens, it's very hard to dissociate with that identity.
Well, it's true that, especially in the context of Assam, the tension between Adivasis and the tribes, especially the Boros, that's very valid in that. So that's why I was making the kind of argument that among tribes, there is also a sort of a colonization taking place, like bigger tribe trying to colonize a smaller tribe. For instance, the issues, not only in Assam, but if we look at Mizoram, how the Mezos and the Chakmas, the tussles between those two, and claiming that Chakmas are not original settlers, and they don't have a right to settle down in Mizoram. Especially similarly also in the case of Arunachal tension. So I think we need to address these issues of the bigger tribes, because for one there are tribes whose number are as large as 1 million, and there are some tribes whose population is less than 1,000. For instance, like Chotes, they're small tribe, and literally they don't have any voice in that. So they're like a pendulum. They switch from one tribe to another tribe depending on the situation. And you also rightly pointed out about the violence. The best example I think I could give is in the context of Manipur. The Chotek tribe, because they've been like sandwiched between two major tribes, that is Nagas and Kukis. Depending on the situation, sometimes they identify as Nagas, sometimes again they identify as Kukis. So who has the power in this thing? So I think that has happened across. There are facts emerging out of that.
The question of Hinduizing, right? The heavy project of Hinduizing the tribal,
Yeah, once again in that aspect, I think that's one of the emerging reality about the Hinduism taking place in tribal areas. For instance, coming back to this Arunachal state, there are many tribes who has embraced into Hindus. And now it's very interestingly, instead of speaking themselves in their language, they even communicate in Hindi. So that's the level which it has penetrated into that aspect. So I think one need to be very cautious about and do further research into that aspect of the aspects of assimilations and appropriating to the larger culture.
Yeah, but
Yeah, my name is Venkat Maharaj. I'm part of the Boston Study Group. Sorry, apologies. I drove for 1 hour. Have you followed recently what's happening in Telangana, where there's a big fight between Banjaras and Adivasis in parts of Adilabad and those districts, to the extent that the government shut down the internet 2 months almost. Probably you're not aware of.
Sorry, I didn't follow.
Yeah, this just happened. It's a very sad development. But the Banjaras, the Lambadis, yeah, they and Adivasis had a big fight. Because the Lambadas were made tribes in 1970, and then Lambadas never lived in the they're not like in the jungles or hilly. They're plains. They lived, and they're more closer to civilization, and most of this tribal reservation is actually taken over by the Lambadis. So now recently the Adivasis got some sensitization, but the politics used, there was a huge fight between these two communities. So
I have read about a bit of Lambadas and Adivasi, but I didn't follow the recent event.
Yeah, recent
because similar things also happen in northeast India.
Okay.
For instance, the Adivasis, that is deep tribes in Assam, we are not recognized as tribe. It belongs to scheduled tribe.
Okay.
So there is also a tussle to the fight between the Adivasis and the Boros, especially.
I have another question. Kancha Ilaiah wrote this book called Post-Hindu India. I don't know how many of you have read it, but it came out 7 8 years back. Post-Hindu India. His theory is Hinduism will become minority, in the next 100 years. And there's the biggest religious, war in the sense, competition among, Hinduism, Christianity, and maybe Islam, to, most of the Dalits, tribals, and some of the OBCs will move away from Hinduism. That's his essence of that book. So, I see there's a lot of action happening in tribals, right? A lot of Christian missionaries are there. I don't think a lot of Islam is going and doing anything in the tribal area. But the RSS, on the other hand, has been also took up a very missionary thing, and they're going. Like, have you heard about Ekal Vidyalaya? Yes. Yeah, so this is one of the outfit of the RSS, very, very actively trying to, co-opt tribal. So how do you see this, as they're coming closer to society, mainstream? This is an eventual thing, they have to, I think mostly between Christianity and Hinduism, there's a lot going on. not even much Buddhism happening, anything in the tribal area. So do you see this similar thing in the Northeast and other parts of India?
Well, one of the rising phenomena in the context of India post-reform period, especially in 1990s, now from development paradigms we shifted to religious paradigm. So there is a mixture between development paradigms and religious paradigm. So in a way that waves of religious paradigm and development paradigm, I think is very dangerous in a way. We have to be very cautious about that. And as you also rightly pointed about the waves of works of missionaries, both Christians, both RSS. If we look at even in Northeast India, this phenomena is occurring. So I don't have an answer about this thing. I don't have a positions on the religious matter, but definitely on the aspect of development, it should not be imposed development. Rather, should make the development should also have equal shareholders of the indigenous people or the tribal peoples.
You want to ask something? I mean, one of the things, really, since nobody's asking, please ask. But I'll just kind of provoke some. I mean, I've seen the RSS recruiting more Adivasis as their volunteers, Swayamsevaks, and Adivasis are put on the streets for various kind of violences. You know, if there is any, they're used as the spawns. You know. And so whenever there is a violent project going, for example, against Muslims or against Christians, or against Dalits, in fact. So these are mostly, if you go down, even in Godhra, for example, there were Adivasis and Dalits who were actually fighting Musalmans, but not, they were also Pasmanda Musalmans. So what I'm saying is that the caste status remains, and this is very threatening, for example, because with the colonization of Hinduism, there is this new emergent idea coming, and we are seeing now the whole RSS project is to concentrate that mass, and I don't see there is an emancipation of a tribal mass there. It's actually using as a reserve force in events of self-displacement. I mean, how do you read this? I mean, this is a serious thing happening. Especially you were saying, maybe also enlighten us about the project. I mean, how many tribal representatives are in BJP or the right-wing parties? I mean, how do you see this development?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer and difficult thing to take a position as of now. I could just speculate on that rather than taking any position as such. Of course, last 2 years back, there was an RSS march in Shillong in Meghalaya. More than 500 tribals were on the street and marching wearing a khaki and shorts. So I think that's one of the examples. And the kind of penetrations it has gone through with the opening of healthcare systems, hospitals, and opening of various ashrams. So it was quite interesting to see how, there on the street it's been marched, And also it comes with, as you say, about the froze of religion, like the spreading of that, or I think the main agenda is about assimilation. They believe that tribes are also, they are Hindus and they need to come back. For instance, the Garwapis movements, and where the churches are being destroyed for celebrating Christmas or Easter. There are instances which are taking place even in tribal belt areas. And also there is the conflict is among those tribes who have converted to Hindus, and there is a conflict among them again. So I don't know how should we interpret that, or how should we look at that. So I don't want it to be cautious indeed. And the nationalist agendas in penetrating that. So.
My apologies for being have a late class. Charles from Australia. As an Indigenous Australian, I'm fascinated to, unfortunately I missed most of your talk, but fascinated to learn of the tribes of India and Indigenous Indians. And I'm I'm fascinated by this visibility or invisibility. Certainly from my poor perspective as an Indigenous Australian around the tribes of India, And I suppose, what do you think needs to happen in terms of reaching out to the brotherhood and sisterhood globally? And what are the kind of the key messages that you would tell us? Not what just unites us, but what are the things that we can either A, do to help you, or just to help each other? So yeah, and including that concept of invisibility, and what are the barriers to it, and what do we need to do? Because as an Indigenous Australian, I'll let Brandon talk for himself, but we do get airtime, for example. We get visibility. A lot of it can be negative. And one of the things I think for that is there's 24 million Australians. Now, while we're at 3%, I think we're just approaching 800,000. We don't have to deal with the numbers that you have to deal with. We don't have to, even just on the basis of religion, the number of religions in Australia competing for, dominance, airtime. So I'm interested in how you raise that level of visibility and the conversations that you would have with Indigenous Australians or other Indigenous groups.
Well, that's quite interesting for us. As you also pointed out, invisibilizing our voice is one of the biggest problems. And on top of that, the Indian state not recognizing scheduled tribes as indigenous people, even though India is a signatory to UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. So if we kind of reach out to the global or sort of a collaboration, I think look also if the pressures also comes from other parts of the country, I think we have really good collaboration into that. The biggest thing is that if government not recognizing the in us are really in the bottom of it and they don't even fill up the reserve seats out, So we would really love to have a collaboration, especially international collaboration, so that our voices also in a way, in a small way, can be heard, or like through the solidarity as other indigenous groups, like for instance from New Zealand, Australia, or even Central America.
So help me understand something. My name is Brandon Stevens. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians from North Carolina. So I don't know what the knowledge of Native American culture and our challenges, our successes are to this audience. But here we fight being wiped out. With the near 300 million or over 300 million citizens in the United States, we make up about 1% of the population. So we're about 6 million if you include the Alaskan Native villagers and the Hawaiians. We're about 3 million if you just count those in the lower 48. And it's there that, see, we're considered city-states. We are tribal nations unto ourselves. So the United States government works with us like they would a foreign country. And it's made all kinds of disparities over time. They've tried to implement things where we measure our blood quantum to determine citizenship, which eventually, as people roam, the blood quantum goes down, and so we suddenly begin to feel like we're being erased, and we stop measuring our citizenship on our practices, our beliefs, our values, how we interact with one another, and our governance has been taken out of our hands, and we're fighting to get that back. So I'm wondering how, for me, educate me just a moment on how the tribal nations or the tribes, or are they considered nations or city-states, or what's their governance in India, or is it just a group of people that you know, collectively cohabitate in a certain area, or how does that work? And I think that helps me understand a little bit more, you know, so with how we can work together, because. But I think some pretty cool things that are going on in other with other tribes around the world is how they maintain those practices, traditional practices, their language, their identity, which is something that we are working here to really maintain, because even this university in its original purpose was to educate Indian youth for assimilation, you know, to teach the white man ways, and get you into the basically it was a colonialization. So a couple things here. Just tell me about how the function of governance, if there is such a thing, and then I'm curious here to see how you guys maintain the cultural identity that makes you a tribe, and that's one of the strengths that we need to practice here to build the sovereignty of the Native American people.
Well, thank you for the question. In India, those who are scheduled as tribe, the population is 104.3 million. So that is 8.6% of the India's total populations. How do the government identify tribes? It's in a way very interesting to see. There is no clear characterizations or the criteria to define tribes or who are to be scheduled as tribe. It's purely governed under the Constitution of India in Article 342 with the wishes of the President of the country in consultation with the governor of the respective state. Of course, the constitutions of India recognize the autonomy of tribes about its relationship to governance system. For instance, the 5th schedule of the Constitution and the 6th schedule recognize the autonomy of tribes in terms of land and in terms of resources, or in terms of the water or other forest resources. But what is happening is that, for instance, in spite of its constitutional provisions, the kind of manipulation is taking place and the kind of land alienation the tribals are facing is, I think, one of the major problems. For instance, in 5th and 6th scheduled areas, non-tribals are not allowed to buy land of the tribal lands. But what is happening is that if we look at all the mega development projects, for instance, hydropower project, mining, are mostly located in tribal areas. And as I also pointed out, 8.5 million people who are displaced in India are tribals. And when tribals in a way agitate or protest against such development projects, they are being tagged as anti-development. They're being displaced, but on top of losing their resources, their land, their water, they're being tagged as anti-development. The tribals are anti-development and they don't want development. But on the other hand, tribes, they argue that, for instance, connectivity. We argue that we want greater connectivity, but not of the kind imposed by the Indian state, which bypasses our law in terms of constructing of a highway. So in 1974, again, the government of India had the concept called tribal subplan, trying to make development particularly for the tribals. So the dimension of development was added. And in 1990s, there is also an extension of Panchayat Raj in the tribal areas, whereby they recognize the governance systems of the tribal culture, custom, and traditions of that. In spite of all these recognitions, but tribes still remains at the bottom of it. For instance, one example is in the state of Arunachal Pradesh, which is border to China. The government of India has approved the construction of 127 dams to generate 50,000 megawatts of electricity, and that is supposed to supply it to the outside. And if we look at those things, the dams, the hydropower project locations, those are the places where electricity are not available. So such is the kind of situations. On the one hand, it's been recognized. On the other hand, it's like keep suppressing of the tribal rights. And we would love to hear you have a dialogue. It would be really great.
Charles,
I'm just following up on a previous comment you made. You talked about
Affirmative actions, yes.
You said some of the positions weren't filled.
Yes.
Why is that?
One thing, it's quite interesting to see how these affirmative actions operate, or in India, this is called reservations. So, for us, I said, tribes in India comprises of 8.6% of the total population, whereas the reservation is earmarked with 7.5 of the 7.5%. What happened in most of the upper echelons positions is that the advertised in such a way whereby tribe doesn't have any qualification to qualify for that. As a result, when the posts are not being filled, after a few years, that post is being passed on to other category. To regular category. So if we look at about this bureaucratic systems and about every ministry or every department, the earmark of 7.5% to be filled by these tribes are not at all filled.
And then you lose them.
Yes, eventually.
I would like to add on to that. While there is a reservation, the affirmative action is at a higher level. That is once you finish high school. So if you compare the amount of money that is spent on education, the kind of education facilities in areas which are tribal, it's really low. So then tribal kids don't really, they can't get, you have to at least clear high school to get to be eligible for those jobs. So
yeah, so just to add, the affirmative action it's existed since the independence, so 70 years. But there are especially the so-called elite universities. They basically, there are scores of, especially the science and technology are the worst culprits. There are so many departments exist even today. Some of the so-called, the top institutes of India, they get pride in, internationally. None of the one department, in IIT Chennai and, some of these institutions, there are departments exist for last, let's say they existed for 50 years now. Not a single PhD, Dalit PhD, not a single Dalit faculty is there recruited until now. There are so many such things, especially in the top universities. So it's been a very, very big struggle. So the higher education, especially science and technology, and some level of bureaucracy, you could never reach to the top level. The quotas were never filled. Yeah. And same thing with Dalits, and tribals is even worse here.
And it's just to add, it's a South Asian, sorry, it's a South Asian problem. Thanks to Pakistan's first law minister, who was also a Dalit, Jogendranath Mandal, I'm sure.
Yeah.
He was
East Pakistan.
Yeah, he was East Pakistan, and there was a 5% quota for Dalits for scheduled caste, I think. I'm not sure actually. And that wasn't always, and even now the quotas are not filled, so it's pretty much across the board, So we have the same, so we have scheduled castes and Dalits in Pakistan as well, but same sort of challenges are faced by them. Even though we supposedly are not a caste society because we're Muslims, But,
See, what you're seeing, some of us here, the first generation in these 70 years, we could come to that light and able to talk, So in India also it's happening, but it's a very, very slow process. Yeah.
Yes.
Raile. So just a question about, especially in regards to Northeast India. We have 7 or 8 states that are predominantly, at least in the case of say Nagaland and Manipur and Arunachal, Mizoram, those are predominantly dominated by tribal groups, right? At the same time, you see these tribal groups at the very bottom in terms of, just in terms of numbers, especially compared to the rest of India. Could you speak a little bit about that in terms of how even, I'm from Nagaland, by the way, so as someone from Nagaland, seeing a state like Nagaland being marginalized despite, the tribals having, power, seeming power in that sense. Could you?
Well, yeah, in the context of Northeast, for instance, if we were to look at tribal conditions in Northeast, I think it's relatively better than that of the other parts of the country. For instance, if we look at literacy rate, Mizoram state has got the second highest in India. So Mizoram has got above 90% of total population of Mizorams are tribals. But one of the issues which again is facing is in the context of like Tripura. Tripura was once a tribal state, but now tribals became minority in that state. So the wave of the frost also interesting to look at. And coming to the aspects of marginalizations in terms of Northeast, also in states in Northeast, I think one of the reasons I could speculate in that is that political representation is very low. For instance, if we look at the whole Northeast India, how many MPs, like members of parliament, do we send? Below 30. So in a way, it's in the electoral politics, it is negligible. Look at the state of Nagaland, there is only one Lok Sabha. An example of Manipur, there are only 2. So the center in a way obviously did not give much consideration because the politically, electorally, it doesn't make much significance to Indian larger politics of. And if you look at the state of UP, it has more like largest Lok Sabha seats. And also, it has to do, I think, historically, why Northeast is today as Northeast, remain as a Northeast. We need to go back to the history and how the Indian state perpetuate the colonial framework or colonial legacy of it. If we look at the Treaty of Yandabo, which was signed in 1826, the king, the Assam monarch and the Manipuri king invited British to come and defend them so that they could fight the forces, the king of Ava of Burmese, king of Burma. And what happened during that war was that the Burmese forces were defeated. As a result, the Assam king gave certain territory to the British forces and became, as a reward to that. So it was in 1826 where a line was drawn between Myanmar and now what is called India. The boundary line was demarcated. And the state of Manipur and Tripura became a protectorate of the British. So if we look at again, like historically, what happened after the post-independence is that the government of India, in a way, isolated the regions and also perpetuated the same thing. So the British they follow the policy of something called excluded area and partially excluded areas. So politically, administratively, they were left alone, even though the resources are being drained out of it. For instance, the discovery of Assam oil, mineral resources, and Assam tea was one of the biggest attractions. As a result, the British started constructing roads whereby they could extract the resources. The similar kind of phenomena is taking place even till today. Like the political aspirations are being responded with military response. Like I think the best example I could give was in the form of, if we look at in 1940s and 1950s, the Indian state approach to the region is more of cultural paradigm, whereby there's lots of ethnic groups, a culture, it's a mosaic of ethnic culture need to be protected. That they have been dancing, like singing, they have been exalted, been assumed. But what happened in 1960s is again after especially the China-Indo war, they shifted the approach to security paradigms, whereby the militarization started taking place, and there are oldest paramilitary force known as Assam Rifles. It was initially raised by the British, and they were like the legacy still continue. So after the war, the security approach dominated, and also given the border tension between North. By the way, the Northeast India shared 98% of boundary with internationally, and only 2% of the territory share with the rest of India. They call it chicken neck. It's in the Siliguri corridor. So again, there's a shift from security paradigm to political paradigms, because there was a tension, because there are many tribes demanding for the recognition of sovereignty, and with the mushrooming of insurgent movements, they say, okay, your demands for a state, just give it. That's how the Nagaland state was also created. The Mizoram state was also before a Lusai Hills district. So the Mizoram state was carved out of Assam. Similarly, Meghalaya was carved out of Assam. So Manipur was given a full-fledged stage. Nagaland was given a full-fledged stage. Arunachal Pradesh, which was now at the frontier track, was lifted up and given as a full-fledged stage. So there was in 1970s and 80s, there was aspects of political aspirations, and they keep in order to suppress the issues. That was the response of the Indian state towards the Northeast. And by 1990, what happened is that the political aspects or the cultural dynamic aspect is not enough. So the government of India came up with something called development paradigms. So in 1990, coincidentally, it coincided with economic reform period in the regions. So you say, if we give development, if we construct highways, if we construct IITs, like for instance, engineering college, medical college, the issues of the tribal people would die down, or it would respond, but it is not so. Rather, it came so strongly. So now the latest, what is happening today is also, as we say a little bit about the religious paradigm. So in terms of the religions, and now the current government and the other governments, so the elections in 3 northeastern states are happening. So there is also a lots of dynamism going on that aspect. So there's a combinations of development along with religious line. And also, you know, the minimum roles of the electoral politics, it has to do it.
If we don't have any questions.
Just a
yeah, sure.
question.
Yes, sir.
The British introduced something called the FCR, which is the Frontier Crimes Regulations, in the west frontier and also Balochistan regions of what was then British India, obviously now parts of Pakistan. This was crimes regulations which gave a lot of power and unity of government to the Deputy Commissioner's office, and there was no, essentially judicial functions were also carried out, and then there was the power of, the collective punishment, for example, that was meted out to, so for example, if somebody from the tribes did something, so I was just wondering, is there something of that kind here in your Northeast?
Thank you for bringing up that issue. It's very much prevalent. The British, in fact, introduced something called inner line permit, whereby the imaginary line was drawn between the foothills and the plain area. Basically, the rationale behind this inner line permit was that because tribals from the hills rights the plain people, and also they're being distracted when the British carry out any expeditions towards the hill area. So there was the rights by the tribals. Why the tribals, in a way, their rights is that they wanted to protect their own territory. There are places whereby earmarked as distance from the tribals in northeast area. As a result, the concept called inner line permit was came out, and it was being implemented, and the line was being drawn. So in order to cross that line, tribes has to take permission from the authority. So till today, the concept of the inner line permit is applicable in 3 states of Northeast.
Inner line permit.
Inner line permit, yes, in the state of Arunachal, Nagaland, and Mizoram.
Just to add that, you know about this Indian Tribes Criminal Tribes Act?
Yes.
That was so notorious act, and it existed until 70s, right? In the government. Yeah,
For the benefit of audience.
Yeah, maybe he knows much better than.
Please go ahead.
No, you know, we must be knowing a lot better than me. Right? All the tribals were, there's Indian, criminal tribes acts. that they brought British, so that basically they made all the tribes as criminals by default.
Yeah,
And that law existed.
That's exactly what they did
Yeah.
with the Pashtun tribes in
Yes.
Pakistan. So, yeah.
So and that law existed until Indian government didn't repeal it for very long. And I think probably you know exact date, but late 60s, 70s. Until then, it was not repealed. And that's
still haven't.
yeah, it's notorious. I mean,
For
that
instance,
law.
some of the tribes in Maharashtra were known as criminal tribes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
yeah,
That,
so
no,
you
in
read,
all the Telugu lands, everywhere.
True.
So you
That's
read-
exactly, that's what I'm referring to.
So you read
They
the
was an Indian
gazettes.
Criminal Tribals Act.
Exactly, you read the
They just
gazettes
made all
and-
the tribals criminals.
Yeah.
And the Indian government took so much time to repeal that law.
Exactly.
It's very sad.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
can you elaborate on why you think that act was enacted? Was there
See, I mean, a lot of theories, the British did a lot of evil things. I mean, I'm not, right? So to have the control, I mean, I'm not an expert, but what they did is, these tribals who are living in the villages, some of them resorted to, their stealing was their profession. Very few of them, small. And I think then they found many incidences, happening, and suddenly they just made a law to make all the tribes criminal, and then even in some places they basically cordoned off, bring them to an area. It's like they kept them kind of a prison, so they've done a lot of things. So, but the funny thing is, Indian government took so long to repeal that law.
And just to sort of add, the British had two kinds of provinces, from what I understand. If I'm wrong, you obviously would know better. There were the regulated provinces, which would have criminal regulation. So all of what is now Pakistan right now was a regulated area, in the sense that there were criminal regulations was specifically for tribes.
Some areas, tribal areas.
And then there were the deregulated provinces, where there was some form of representative government that was coming up, which is parts of India, most of India, I suppose, is, yeah. But yeah, that was sort of the British policy of. But then you have to kind of also look at the British in retrospect, and see that they were mercantile power acting in self-interest. But then they did produce, or the contribution that there wouldn't have been Dr. Ambedkar, perhaps, if they weren't the British. I mean, I just want to put it out there,
I mean, this has been very engaging and robust discussion, actually. I thank you all for coming. We have discussed issues like cultural, for example, the tribals in India. When we think about tribal community, we have this fetishized image, a stereotypical almost segment and appropriation of what a tribal means. And then we also, as there were shifting paradigms, Raile was suggesting, was also security. When we talk about security, we are looking at the tribals as being the militant Maoists who are recruited by the Brahminical forces, and again as the outlaws. Then about the political development, the representation through affirmative action as a constitutional right gets represented. However, their elevation into positions of power, for example in the Council of Ministers, doesn't fall into place. The development-led projects against the multinational corporations, or also native corporations, has always been favorable, whether it's a communist government or a government which is liberal left, or a right-wing government. And at the bottom of it, we see the tribal people suffering this very pugnacious form of system which uses the language of development. And then you said there is a religion paradigm. So we see within the religion dynamics too, there is a heavy-handed or underhanded concept of almost migrating the community from their own cultural traditions into a new, and incorporating into as a Hindu order. So what does this say? This says that we are living in a very distorted version and vision of when it comes to the tribal communities. We almost don't know that there are 104 million indigenous Indians living in India who are undergoing almost similar forms of oppression that our other brothers and sisters who are indigenous people in their own countries remain affected similarly. So the question remains, why have there not been active solidarity so far yet? One of my hypotheses and is the people who were representatives of this cause were themselves not tribal people. These were people who were Brahmins most predominantly, who acted as ambassadors of various causes in various conferences. And also we don't know how many tribal representatives are there in, for example, foreign services of India, who could actually go and rally for their cause. Another incident we read, especially from the Indian left circle, is this notion that tribal people are protesting against the multinational corporations, and then there is heavy recruitment of these people fighting against the state. So we see tribal image is very unclear and messier as more